Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here for the SEC's new Cybersecurity Risk Management Rule panel. We're just going to give this another 30 to 60 seconds to let a few more people join as we see people signing up right now. So just please bear with us for a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think we're at critical mass here, so we'll get this kicked off. Again, thank you for joining us for this panel on the SEC's new Cybersecurity Risk Management Rule. The anticipated new rule, commonly known as the Cyber Rule, is set to reshape the cybersecurity compliance landscape for investment managers. Managers will need to meet new legal and regulatory requirements and standards that will upend their current technological, operational, governance, and compliance functions as each relates to cybersecurity. Today, we hope to provide a plain English explanation on how to approach and comply with the Cyber Rule. The panelists of this webinar are subject matter experts, proficient in technology, law, regulatory compliance, security, and governance specific to the asset management space. The panelists will explain the new Cyber Rule, breaking down each of its 4 constituent parts into bite-sized, digestible concepts in plain business language. I'll begin by introducing myself and our panelists. I'm Adam Menkes. I currently serve as the Global Head of Business Development at Atlas Technica, a premier provider of outsourced IT services and cybersecurity solutions to the alternative investment industry. Prior to my joining Atlas, I worked in prime brokerage at Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, and Morgan Stanley, where my responsibilities included strategic consulting around all things on the non-investment side for startup and existing alternative asset managers. Joining me is Jacob Kane, the head of cybersecurity risk services at Salis GRC, a risk and compliance consultancy for investment managers. Jacob has over 25 years of experience providing cybersecurity and IT services to the alternative investment industry and has overseen cybersecurity programs for hundreds of investment firms. And last but certainly not least, we have John Aranio, who leads Cole Freeman & Mallon's Cyber Law Practice Group. John has focused his practice on the SEC's evolving policies on cybersecurity. He is an investment management attorney, a cybersecurity expert, author, and speaker who has interfaced directly with the SEC's cyber unit on numerous occasions, specifically on the Cyber Rule. John also has performed over 500 operational cybersecurity assessments for asset managers of all sizes. In recent years, John also co-founded and helped design a cyber-forward technology infrastructure company. So he brings a unique multidisciplinary background to the discussion, encompassing technology, security, and legal and regulatory expertise. Okay, now that we've done the intros, I'd like to provide an overview of today's discussion. First, we're going to provide you with an update on the regulatory landscape around cybersecurity. We'll then discuss what is and is not required under the new Cyber Rule, specifically for private fund managers and RIAs. We'll wrap up the panel discussing some advice on what managers can and should be doing now in preparation for the Cyber Rule. And finally, we'll address any questions you may have in Q&A. Please also note that during the discussion, we'll have 3 polling questions to provide us with some real-time feedback in hopes that we can make the discussion interactive. And we also obviously hope that you ask some questions along the way. So we'll begin the panel. As promised, John is going to begin by giving us a high-level overview of the regulatory landscape and explain what the Cyber Rule will change. John, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate that. So as the title portends, we're entering an entirely new cybersecurity compliance regime that the SEC has since about 2022 scoped out for us. And as we are about to enter this new regime that has significant and in some cases new categorical changes, we thought it'd be helpful to sort of contextualize this. In other words, how did we get here? Incidentally, before we begin, a note on timing. Last month, my team met with the cyber unit to ask about the status of the rule. The rule is still in its proposed form and had been set to be approved last year. When we spoke with 8 staff attorneys in the cyber unit last month, they had indicated they're actively working on it. We asked again because they didn't give a straight answer. And they had pointed us to last year, there was a similar rule for public companies on cyber risk management, and they indicated they passed that in July. We've taken the position that it's going to be passed this year, and our conversations with the SEC and some of the postings they made seem to indicate that. So a lot of today will be about preparing for this. So on to background, really the SEC's policy around cybersecurity really emanated and began on March 26, 2014. That was when they had a cybersecurity roundtable. That was followed by a series of expressions from the SEC, mostly in the form of risk alerts and guidance updates, similar materials, and especially in several enforcement actions where they enforce these policies. And that's been going on since about 2015. There have been a couple of cybersecurity sweeps by the SEC in addition to that. But I think what's important to frame today's discussion is to really break it down what the ask is right now as we enter an anticipated passing of the new rule, which we'll see the changes we're going to discuss today. What the cyber ask, if you will, has really been from both the regulator and ODD firms boils down to 2 primary tasks. One is to create reasonably designed and appropriately scaled policies and procedures. And the other sort of ask is to do these periodical and mostly being deemed annual cybersecurity assessments. The policies are based around 7, what we called the Cyber 7. These are 7 elements that are basically a combination of technological controls and non-technological controls, and some are hybrid. The good news to this is that nothing in the current regime before the rule gets passed, nothing will be obsolete when the new rule does pass. All of this is cumulative. So all of those that have been working and trying to comply with the rule will be able to bring that over into the new regime's rules. Jacob, did you want to comment a little bit on the current regime as well?
Yeah, I think it's very important, right, what John just said there, which is, you know, a few points, right? One is that most of those requirements as they exist today, right, are not going away. The new rules are taking where those existing requirements are today and adding a few items. And as we go through this, we're going to discuss what exists today and where those new requirements are. The biggest change is going to be around how those requirements are brought together. You know, to date, we now are really looking at a 10-year history of the SEC being involved with cybersecurity. And really that body of work and of guidance has cropped up in a few different places. So there's a mix of cybersecurity mentions in rules where cybersecurity gets touched on in other rules. So there are areas around fiduciary duty or protecting client confidentiality that raise the requirement about having reasonable cybersecurity measures. But as to what those cybersecurity measures are, that's really developed separately through a series of risk alerts and other SEC comments, a few enforcement actions, you know, other letters and guidance. So right now, where managers have been operating very vague rules, and then we have a bunch of shoulds, of expectations about what those requirements are. And what these new rules do is bring those things together into really, a codification of where those things are, so that managers will have that clearer understanding of what it is that all in one place. So, John, maybe talk a little bit more about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, so thanks, Jacob. Well stated. I think it's important to note that, as Jacob said, when this new rule is finalized and it's codified, it brings a lot more formality to the last 9 years and what people have been doing. And as we pick the rule apart today a little bit, high level, hopefully it'll become apparent that it's implicit in the new rule that there will need to be more of a commitment, engagement, continuity, and accountability for managers and advisors with regard to their cybersecurity program. That said, let's move on to what the new rule is and try to break it down. Since cybersecurity really is a multifactorial challenge, combining technology, operations, legal, regulatory, governance, and a lot of other disparate controls, it requires a multidisciplinary approach, and some of this could potentially get technical. Our aim for today was just to try to high-level break down the rule into its biggest constituent pieces, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So we've separated this out into 4 blocks that we're going to cover. So let me introduce the 4 blocks now, if I could. And it's probably a good time to note that after the webinar, we're going to be disseminating a guide that will highlight a lot of these points that we're going to gloss over today. So we refer to the big pieces of the rule, there's 4 of them, as blocks. The first block is the obligation to create policies and procedures. And that will be a major focus of today. That will be the heavy lift of what we're talking about. And for advisors in complying, a lot of the work will be done in creating these appropriately scaled policies and procedures. The second block is a new requirement to report certain cybersecurity incidents to the Commission. The third block is a requirement to disclose your cybersecurity risk to your investors. And the fourth block is probably the most linear of all of the requirements, and it's a record-keeping requirement around everything cybersecurity. Adam, I think you're on mute.
There was. So before we get into the details of the blocks, we're going to start with our first polling question. If you don't mind answering directly into the presentation, you can click on each one of these items. Do you have a written information security policy? And if so, do you update it regularly? I'll give you a little bit of time to go ahead and answer that question, please. See people answering pretty quickly here, so give it a couple of seconds. Okay. Looks like we got a good number of people that have answered. So looks like still a significant number of people, far larger than I thought, do not have a WISP. And again, we would encourage you to go ahead and get that updated or created. You have one, but have not updated regularly. I'm not surprised about that. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of these rules are being passed, so that people will continue to update their information security policies. But luckily, over half are still updating their information security policy on a regular basis. Okay, so let's get into some of the details here. Again, John, please get us kicked off on the first block.
Thanks. Yeah, so the block 1, as I mentioned, policies and procedures. Again, the heaviest lift for managers in doing this correctly, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today. What we'll try to do today, and if you read the rule, as the 3 of us have, hopefully you don't have to, you'll see that there are certain elements that need to be prevalent in your policies and procedures. We refer to them as the Cyber 5. The first of these 5 elements is to do risk assessments. These are periodic risk assessments that need to be done at least annually. So a couple of points about that, and then I'll hand it over to Jacob, who'll walk us through the other 4. So a risk assessment is always the starting point, both initially as you enter a cybersecurity journey, but also periodically and annually each year. It's a time to reassess where you are. The reason for this is because the rate with which technology, regulation, the threat vectors themselves, the way we work, all are in a state of flux and fluid. Cybersecurity is really more of a process and not a project. And so even outside of the SEC, virtually every cybersecurity framework or regime encourages these periodic assessments. So that's not going away. Under the proposed rule, the stated purpose of the assessment is to assess, categorize, prioritize, and document your firm's risks associated with two things: your information systems and also the data that resides therein. Interestingly, these risk assessments really serve as a precondition to drafting the policies, and the policies are supposed to help you address certain risks. The risk assessment is the vehicle that allows you to identify and understand these risks. So the risk assessments themselves feed into and work collaboratively with the policies. I would note that what the SEC is envisioning is that these assessments that need to be done periodically, at least annually, need to be qualitative. And they should address all of the SEC's requirements, including the technological requirements, but also the operational, governance, legal, and security requirements. We're not talking about scans or heat maps or things like that. This needs to be a plain English exercise that SEC examiner or an ODD professional can read and understand. So in addition to this, what we're talking about is an assessment of the advisor and its business. The rule also requires that advisors need to understand and manage counterparty cyber risk with their vendors. So this gives rise to a need to do vendor assessments on your critical vendors. Jacob, do you want to talk a little bit about the vendor assessments?
Sure. So thanks, John. So vendor assessments, much like the advisor risk assessments, need to be conducted on a periodic basis. And in practical terms, that really means annually and whenever there's a material change. So that would be if there's a significant change with that service provider, or your scope with that service provider, or most frequently when you're onboarding that service provider, and ideally doing this risk assessment before you bring them on. So one of the things we often get asked about, there are different managers who have different perceptions of the level of value of this. Sometimes we get asked is this really a critical element of our program? From the SEC's perspective, it absolutely is. And it's something really on par with that advisor risk assessment. The other thing, a few things to note that there are a few changes in how people have done this in the past is, a lot of firms traditionally will rank different service providers into critical or less critical on different cycles. The way the rules are written, our vendors are very much either in scope or not, right? So any vendor that has access to your critical systems or to your critical data is included in that and considered, an essential vendor for these purposes on that service provider. Much like John was talking about that advisor risk assessment, this is also qualitative as well. And the SEC advises that we want to look not just at the technical controls, but also policies and procedures of those service providers. And that's important because we see, differing approaches to service provider risk assessments. And one of them are some people just go out and look at some of those risk rating services from publicly available information to pull that up. And that doesn't really contemplate the policies and procedures of the manager. So it's not really addressing where those requirements are from the SEC. So, you really need to look at where those controls are, look at those policies and procedures. If you're getting, a SOC 2 report, it's not enough to gather one, you have to read it and interpret it. The other piece is that risk assessments alone are not enough. The SEC is explicit that they're also looking for contractual provisions between the advisors and their service providers that address cybersecurity. And that's an area where it's really handy to have an attorney on your team who understands that cybersecurity side of things to talk about those provisions.
Yeah, so a note on that, Jacob, at our law firm, we're often involved and pulled into that. And, there's a lot to do on cyber, so we try to make this a streamlined exercise. And we've been able to do that. A typical manager will have various vendor agreements with different service levels and different reps and warranties. And one of the ways we've tried to attack that is to do sort of a global rider or addendum to sort of streamline the process. And what we found over the last couple of years that most vendors now that are listening to the SEC and ODD firms and their clients are much more open to adding an addendum and putting in reasonable representations, warranties, protections, and indemnities around cyber.
Great, thanks, John. So as we move on to the next section, which is user security and access, and this is a big, broad area where there are large numbers of technical controls. So falling under this umbrella are going to be a lot of technical areas that you think of when you think about, putting your cybersecurity in place: multi-factor authentication, mobile device management, secure remote access. But there's also a lot around the governance and policy. So acceptable use policies fall under this umbrella. Areas, about how you're managing your permissions and access to data, So this is really a key area, probably, it's true across most of these, but particularly so here, where the interplay between your governance and your technical controls is absolutely critical. And when we come in and look at existing programs and do a review, one of the biggest areas of exposure we often see is a disconnect between what's in people's policies and what they're actually doing. And that's one of the areas when the SEC hones in and finds deficiencies, those gaps between what you're promising you're going to do and what you are doing are one of the biggest areas of exposure, right? And so sometimes we'll see a small manager have a 50-page policy where they've thrown everything in the kitchen sink in there of every single best practice they might ever have, but we can look at that and know, there's no way the manager is doing this. And those are the ones we call, the unforced errors of making promises that you don't have to promise, but you're not gonna keep them. Where the SEC does give a huge amount of flexibility is around the specifics of the technologies used. So they're very prescriptive about a number of different areas that they want you to address. They want you to consider them. They want you to be in a position where you could justify your decision if you don't have that control in place. They don't say you have to have mobile device management, but you have to consider it, and you have to have a good reason why you don't have it if you choose not to. Where they really stay away from the specific technologies. And there's a lot of latitude for managers to decide which particular technologies they're going to use to accomplish these items. And that's an area where we really lean very, very heavily on the IT service provider. We're asked frequently by clients, about various technologies, right? Which is the firewall you like best for us? And our answer is almost always the one your IT most comfortable with and support and to monitor. It's really critical to get your IT service provider in the best position of success with the right tools at hand.
Yeah, and to that note, again, we'll often look to clients also to make them successful, giving them some guidance. So for starters, we want to make sure that all of the users are familiar with the firm's acceptable use policy, right? You can write all the policies in the world, but if the people are not aware and not following them, they're basically useless. So we want to ensure that everybody is following the rules and guidelines on the firm's resources, how to use their computers, their mobile devices, and their internet access, obviously, as securely and again, according to firm policy. As Jacob mentioned, we're going to be very focused on user authentication. We're going to include multi-factor authentication, aka MFA, or single sign-on as often as possible. That should be in place and enforced across all users and devices with no exceptions outside of extreme circumstances, with ideally special permission only, and then lockdown once the task has been accomplished where that may have been shut off. We're going to be setting procedures for timely distribution and revocation of access in role changes or offboarding. This is extremely important. We often come into new environments that we're taking over where people who are no longer with the firm may still have active devices or applications that have permissions to sensitive firm data. Data access restrictions should very tightly follow the principle of least privilege. This is a concept in cybersecurity that emphasizes limiting access rights for users to the bare minimum permissions they need to perform their job function. If you do not need it, you should not have access to it, at least not active access. This is particularly crucial for minimizing risks, such as the misuse or exfiltration of sensitive information. And then obviously in a world of hybrid working, which we're all living in now, secure remote access is also paramount. So the use of solutions such as mobile device management like Microsoft Intune with conditional access will ensure data is only accessed on authenticated devices, and the firm's cyber policies are enforced fully on those devices. So that's going to segue us over into the information protection discussion. And we often find that funds have gaps in understanding where their data is, and we look to help them out. So again, it's really important to keep formal folder infrastructure, to conduct regular data inventory and permission scans if possible as well. Funds will want to go through and thoroughly understand how information is accessed, stored, and transmitted, and they want to manage appropriate methods around the transmission of data. So for example, funds may want to take measures determining if emailing of sensitive data is the best method of delivery in all situations, right? Maybe you want to set up some type of file share that's more secure for user access. And ideally, encryption is used wherever possible, no matter where the data resides or what transmission method is being utilized. And of course, again, it's very important to confirm that information systems have access controls and malware protection enabled to minimize risk of cyber breach.
Yeah, if I could chime in on that, Adam, obviously information protection is a visceral part of cybersecurity. Most people think they're synonymous, and they largely are, but this is sort of at the heart and soul of cybersecurity. But in the asset management industry in particular, this sort of requires that you need to protect the information, you need to understand where the information resides, and you need to sort of understand where the critical data sets are. The terminology used around that is data governance, data mapping. And so particularly in the asset management space, where we reside in a regulatory regime where they've embraced the idea of you can outsource traditionally centralized functions like compliance, CFO, administration, bookkeeping is readily outsourced to third parties. It's a difficult task to try to understand among your data universe, what are the critical data pools and data sets, and then who's using them, where do they sit, are they duplicative? Again, the service provider community has gotten more friendly and understand collectively that we all need to do this for advisors. But the point here is just as implicit in protecting your data. At some point, you need to understand your data footprint, your data universe, where all the information resides, and then, as Adam also said more than once, to be able to identify the critical data pools and protect them accordingly.
Yeah, on a very simple level, right? It's just knowing, what is my critical data, where is it, and who has access to it. And that sounds very simple, but in practice, right, this is an area that we see a lot of advisors are pretty deficient in. And a lot of that area, right, is about the ongoing housekeeping and maintenance. So a good IT firm or cybersecurity consultant can do a really good job of telling you who does have access to what, but someone with knowledge of the business really needs to chime in with that understanding and that piece of who should have access to what, and participate in a regular schedule about, kind of a schedule of events, right? I'm going to check those permissions, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually on some regular cadence, keeping up with that, making sure that they're on top of, have people left the firm? Are they joining the firm? Have I notified my IT team about that? Am I getting the right permissions changed, and keeping up to date with that is really critical on that information protection piece. The next area that we move on to is threat and vulnerability management, which is nice. This is a pretty straightforward one. But in some ways, it's gotten extra straightforward because this was something that was long lived in the realm of things that the SEC has suggested and put as a strong shoulds. And now these are very hard and fast requireds. So the rules are very explicit. Threat and vulnerability management are things that are required for all advisors. They are two separate and distinct things. Threat management is really about identifying those threats and events often as they're happening, right? So that's things like managed detection and response or SOC SIM, where there's monitoring to see, effectively, is someone attacking my systems right now or in my system to do to get them out of there, to shut that down. Vulnerability management, on the other hand, is more proactive, right? This is where we're looking at systems in advance of any bad event, trying to prevent that from happening, usually using automated tools to scan what's out there. For instance, we use a tool that's got a library of over 160,000 known vulnerabilities across different types of systems. Clearly, there's no way that a human being can manually keep up to date with all of those things, right? But hackers have software that is known, right? They have the same database and they have automated exploits to look through these things. So really the idea with vulnerability management is you're doing that preview to look to see what's out there, identify those, and get that information where you can remediate those in advance. And those are absolute requirements. The other things where the SEC is strongly looking for this is ideas that these should be endpoint based to the extent possible and done on an ongoing basis. And then once you do discover where those threats or vulnerabilities are, to have a great process in place for responding to and remediating them.
You're on mute, Adam.
Sorry about that. And again, in our view, the consultants and MSPs should be working together on the vulnerability management, right? So in many cases, the governance firm will do the vulnerability scans. In some cases, we'll do the vulnerability scans. We want to make sure that we have the capability to do so we can address known vulnerabilities as quickly as possible. So if there's something new in the wild, right, we want to be able to scan across all of our assets and get to work on it. But we very strongly encourage third-party scans to make absolutely sure we haven't missed anything and to ensure proper governance. So we're also going to handle threat management in real time as another layer of protection on top of that to cover that side of the house.
Okay. That's great. And so the next piece where we're looking at that is the incident response and recovery. And it's interesting to note here in terms of the emphasis that the SEC puts on this, that they're breaking it out into its own topic, right? A lot of times in the past, we look at this as just a piece of those cybersecurity policies, but the SEC highlights this to the degree of making it its own topic. So it's both a requirement that there is a cybersecurity incident response plan, that it's documented, that it addresses both the ongoing operations of the firm, protection of data, and critically, the ability then to report to the SEC. And those pieces we're going to talk a little further in those future blocks. These are some of these new requirements around reporting and disclosure, but effectively, you can only report what you know about and to be in a spot to do that. So having a cybersecurity incident response plan and program around that is essential to meeting that. The SEC has not as a requirement, but as a strong should, a recommendation that firms test that cybersecurity incident response program. Basically we run through those of, all right, if there's a business email compromise, this is what shows up. What do we do next? Do we work? Who do we call? How do we notify them? So the other piece on the last part here is the annual written report. And this is an area that is a new requirement. John, let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So for those attendees that are actually paying attention to the slides, they'll see that kind of rounds out the 5 elements of the policies and procedures, which we discussed, and they're listed on the slide. For those paying close attention, there's a 6th bullet there that talks about this annual written report. That's separate and apart from the 5 elements, but we thought it warranted a moment to just sort of express what this is, because it demonstrates the higher level of engagement and continuity year to year that managers are going to be held to than in the current environment. So in addition to developing these policies, and in addition to doing this annual cybersecurity assessment exercise, there's now this new requirement to produce an annual written report. So this will require managers, the purpose of it is to force managers to review the design and effectiveness of its policies and procedures, and any changes to it over the past year. Again, the continuity and accountability element. So the deliverable here, the takeaway here is that the manager needs to prepare a written report that describes the annual review and the assessment and any control tests that are done, things like penetration tests, configuration reviews, things of that nature, and explain the results thereof. So again, more engagement into the cybersecurity program. The annual report also you'll need to document any cybersecurity incident that occurred since the date of the last report. And then finally, the report will also have to discuss any material changes to the policies and procedures since the date of the last report. So that is an additional requirement, and this first block of policies procedures is to develop what we really refer to as a cybersecurity program that includes policies and procedures, annual risk assessments, and then at the end of the year or the 12-month period to produce this annual written report to tie everything up and demonstrate continuity year to year of where you are, what you've covered, and where you're going.
Great. So that's going to bring us to the conclusion of the first section. And now in between, we're going to get our second polling question here. So please go ahead and answer that directly in the presentation. Have you conducted an operational security assessment within the past 12 months? We'll give that a 30 to 60 seconds to let people go ahead and answer that one as well. I'm also going to, while we wait on that, going to ask Jacob a question to clarify. In the last section, you had mentioned about tabletop exercises. We just want to confirm that you are or are not in favor of the annual tabletop exercises.
Absolutely. We are very in favor of the tabletop exercises. We think they're a very useful element in their own right. And then also a key element of preparing firms, in case even with the best of intentioned firms may have reporting requirements, which can be pretty stringent. We'll talk about that later. We want to put everyone in that best position where if the SEC says, okay, you flubbed this one, it looks like an honest mistake perhaps, but what'd you do to prepare? If you're in a spot where you've done those tabletop exercises, which is the SEC's strong recommendation, I think you're going to be in a very, very different position than if you said, what did you do to prepare? We ignored your advice and did nothing. That's not a great spot to be in.
Great. So answers to the operational cybersecurity assessment. So about 75% have done so in the past 12 months, but still a significant number have not done a recent cybersecurity assessment, and then a small number still no assessment at all. So hopefully, again, we'll get those folks up to speed shortly after this call, starting this after the webinar. All right, so that will take us to the next section. Now that we understand what the SEC expects in terms of both governance and technological controls, we want to discuss some additional rules that managers need to be aware of. So John, please talk about the reporting requirements.
Thanks, Adam. So yeah, we'll cover the next remaining three blocks. Significant to say that all of these are new requirements that's brought about by the new rule. So block 2 of the 4 is this reporting requirement. The SEC is going to require now that certain cybersecurity incidents, which they'll define as significant, so there'll be significant advisor cybersecurity incidents and significant fund cybersecurity incidents. If a particular cybersecurity incident rises to the level of this, then there'll be a need for the manager to report the details and facts around this incident to the SEC. They'll have to do this on an amended to be created schedule to your Form ADV. It's Form ADV/C. And you'll have 48 hours to complete that after you should have reasonably known or do know about a cybersecurity incident. So one thing to point out very high level, what constitutes a significant cybersecurity incident? Cybersecurity is still somewhat nascent, and there are a lot of events and reporting that's going on, and the community is gradually getting smarter about discerning from the noise the things that a manager needs to know about or a fiduciary needs to know about. And as we continue along that trajectory, the managers still need to balance, is this something that warrants a report to the SEC on this new Form ADVC? So high level, the elements that are in the proposed rule, I don't expect this to change when it's adopted. There's two key elements to what makes a significant cybersecurity incident. And it's basically one that disrupts the advisor's critical operations. And the second element is one that might lead to unauthorized access or use of advisor information that would lead to substantial harm to either the advisor or their investors. A thing to note quickly about this reporting obligation, it's a continuing obligation. So as is the case when you're dealing with remediating a cybersecurity incident, the initial discovery about it eventually yields more information, and the extent or the type or the nature of the actual event is revealed over time. So what this means is that it's quite likely that these Form ADVCs will need to be updated as you discover and assess more about the extent of the incident itself. One final note on Block 2, this reporting obligation. This is a requirement that's confidential with the SEC, and it is in addition to any state breach notification requirements that you may have. The analysis of whether any state law may require a notification of the breach is a separate analysis.
Yeah, so earlier in the conversation, Jacob mentioned the use of a SIEM SOC, right? So a SIEM, which stands for Security Information and Event Management, is basically a tool, a database where we can use to defend against or minimize an incident from becoming significant, right? So for those who are not familiar with it, SIEM technology essentially collects activity data called logs from a company's IT infrastructure, your user devices, your network, your servers, and your applications. And the purpose is really twofold. Number one, it aggregates the log data to generate alerts in real time or near real time. And when potential security threats or anomalies are detected, it'll allow us, and on behalf of the fund, or again, your IT provider, your IT personnel, to act quickly to minimize threats, right? And that is to what John mentioned about minimizing disruption to the operation. The second is if there is a breach, a fund can also use the logs to determine if an incident was significant. And ideally, the logs would prove that thanks to all of the controls we've been talking about in this panel, as we've described, no sensitive data or systems were accessed, and hopefully that will mitigate the need to report. And in addition to that, you can keep those logs typically for anywhere up to a year, maybe longer, but typically around a year. So that, as John mentioned, if you discover something later in time, you can go back and still look at those logs to determine what was accessed, and hopefully it's minimal, mitigating the need to report.
Thanks, Adam. I want to be sensitive to the time. So in the interest of brevity, the last two remaining blocks, Block 3 is also brand new. It's a disclosure requirement. It requires managers to disclose cybersecurity risk to its investors. This will be done on Form ADV, the Part 2A brochure. And what really needs to be disclosed is general cybersecurity risks that are material to the manager for that period of time, and cyber incidents that had occurred over the past 2 fiscal years that are significant. This probably will lead to the need on occasion, if there's a mid-year significant cybersecurity incident, to do interim amendments. So in addition to disclosure, the final block and the most linear and simple, if you will, the simplest block is there will be a record-keeping requirement. So this is a 5-year retention period. It covers all the documents that we're discussing today, the annual report policy, the assessment document, all the control tests, any inquiries and notifications about a breach, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the 4 blocks: policies, procedures, a reporting obligation, a disclosure obligation, and a record-keeping requirement. Jacob, did you want to address quickly some of the notable non-requirements that make sense?
Yeah, so there are a few notable non-requirements. Number one is probably the most common misconception we get are people coming to us and saying, I need a penetration test that's required by the SEC rules. And that is not the case. The SEC rules very clearly do not have that as a requirement. It's really that a penetration test is one type of control test. So the SEC does talk a lot about control tests, and those are strongly recommended, but there's some latitude for the manager to pick the types of control tests that make the most sense to them. So it could be a penetration test, it could be a cloud security assessment, it could be a mock audit. There are a number of different things that go into that control test category. The other interesting one is that training is not a requirement. It is very much a should, and a strong should in the rules. However, training is a topic that has been brought up repeatedly by the SEC for years. Almost everyone in the industry does it. In practice, I think it would be very, very difficult to justify that a manager considered that risk and didn't think it was important enough to address. So although it's technically a non-requirement, I think de facto it's something that people are going to need to do. And that really gets to the end of the requirements that we're going to talk about today. Back to you, Adam.
Great. So we'll now take it to a third and final polling question. How confident are you that your IT team understands all of the SEC cybersecurity requirements and offers appropriate solutions? A, total industry-specific MSP offering cybersecurity solutions. B, they seem to understand my specific cybersecurity needs and are aware. And C, I am not confident. We'll give you a few seconds to answer this as well. While we do that, I think there was one short question in here. We have a question: is it reasonable to assign the responsibility for reporting to the MSP? I'm going to stay away from that one since I'm the MSP. So John and Jacob, if either of you want to take that.
Sure, I'll jump in. So implicit in the rule, Jacob and I have talked about this online together. It's clear that the duties here, it's encouraged to outsource this. You can rely on third-party advisors. The MSP, and as Adam mentioned, I have, and so does Jacob, have frontline experience in being in the shoes of an MSP. And I think over the last 10 years, they've grown in importance in institutionalizing any asset management business. But their primary goal is to make sure the IT systems function. Implicit in that is that everything is secure. But it's not a traditional role of an MSP to make sure you're complying with an SEC rule. So I think what I would say is what's reasonable is to anticipate that your MSP will be involved in the process for the transfer of factual and empirical information that you need to report on, and they should rely on that. And a lot of the industry-specific MSPs like Atlas are very good about that. They're ahead of it. They have account managers that you can reach and access 24/7. That's all important. But really, whoever your cybersecurity advisor is, should be involved in forming that message, and the MSP is only really part of that equation. You shouldn't rely on them to do the reporting for you. That is a misstep.
Okay, thanks for that. And the answers to the questions. So how confident are you your IT team understands the SEC rules cybersecurity? So again, 43% are using an industry-specific MSP. 50% say they seem to understand my specific cybersecurity needs, so at least partially of the way there, and then it's 6.3% saying I am not confident. Okay. All right, on to the next and final section is what should managers do now? What can and should managers do now? So Jacob, I'll let you lead off on this one.
Yeah, so as John said back at the beginning of this this webinar, a lot of what's in the rule are things that already exist today as de facto requirements. And so those are the elements of the places to start with. And again, a cyber risk assessment is the start of any good cybersecurity program, but also start of a cybersecurity compliance program, because if you're working with someone who understands the industry, that risk assessment's not just looking at straight up technical risks, but also a gap analysis of where your program stands against the SEC requirements and what you need to do from that end. Looking at ramping up service provider management to get a program around that if you don't have it, and to start working on those cybersecurity provisions in contracts. That might be a long haul to go back to repaper things, but at least to start getting a program for go forward on new vendors and start talking with vendors about it. Looking at your technical controls, particularly, again, those areas around user access management and controls, the threat and vulnerability management, right? Those are things you're going to need. Looking at the implementing training for your end users and that tabletop testing. As you can see from those later blocks, the reporting and disclosure is going to be a really big piece of where this has teeth. So it's important to understand your incident response and to get that information and to implement that user training. That is one of the most effective measures against the incidents of cybersecurity events, and the stakes are going to be raised, right? No one wants to put anything in their ADV about cybersecurity events over the last 2 years. So you want to be in a spot to be as prepared as possible not to have to make those disclosures. And doing that is engaging your team, right? As the reason why we're doing all of this together on this web, not a single vendor, it's not a single person. It's an internal team, it's compliance, security, and IT working together.
Yeah, I agree. As in most instances, Jacob and I are aligned on this. Really, if there was one action plan or takeaway from this, it's to dive into an assessment. I've done a lot of these for the past 8 years, and what I would say, sort of as buyer beware, understand what this is. This needs to be a gap analysis that's not mapped to HIPAA or not mapped to NIST in a vacuum. The SEC has set forth prescriptive requirements of what you need to do, and that's all you need to do. If you're doing an assessment that talks about other things outside the scope, it's arguably unnecessary. So the idea here is that make sure these assessments are qualitative, that it's a narrative document in plain business language so that an SEC staff member or an ODD professional can read it easily. It should not be simply a scan or a heat map or a checklist or anything like that. I think a good metaphor is almost like an annual checkup. If you want to go into a doctor and have him give you a blood report and say, thanks a lot, take care, let me know if you have any questions, that's one way to handle this. But the other way is to be able, for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to sit with the doctor and ask questions and say, this is a red flag. How do I address it? What does it mean? What am I supposed to do? This is what an assessment is supposed to do. It should outline in plain language what the gaps are. It should also clearly identify and demonstrate the controls that you have in place. And if you're using, as a starting point, you may not have a robust cybersecurity program in place yet, but if you're using an industry-specific, one of the leading MSPs like Atlas, there'll be a lot of controls baked in that you should get a lot of credit for. This should cover not just technological controls, we've said this before, but operational governance and all of the compliance controls. And the assessment will lead to a lot of things that are valuable. It will lead to what control tests you need to do, whether that's a pen test or a Microsoft 365 configuration scan or a variety of control tests. But this will help identify what you should do, but more importantly, what you might not need to spend money on. The assessment will serve as a baseline from which you can do all the things the rule is requiring you to do, which is to show a year-to-year progress at a reasonable cadence. And by cadence, I mean the spend of what you're spending and what you're improving. And then develop a methodical, reasonable path to maturing your cybersecurity program. And all of this exercise that you should be involved in, but certainly should rely on outside expertise, a cybersecurity advisor, will provide the basis for the annual written report. All of this will show the progress and be structured in a reasonable way, and it can be done in a cost-effective manner. So as Jacob said, the starting point is always, both initially and at every year, to do a risk assessment, and that will get you off and running.
Excellent. Okay, so that brings us to a conclusion of the discussion portion of the webinar. And now we'll take a couple of minutes to answer some audience questions that came in as we were going through the presentation. Starting with the first question we had is, after we receive the results of a vendor assessment and certain vulnerabilities have been identified, what are our obligations at that point? What can and do we do with the results? For example, how do we urge the service provider to remediate the vulnerabilities? Jacob, I think you said you would take that, and obviously, John, you're welcome to chime in as well.
Sure. So, the requirements are that you assess your risks, you understand them, and that you act appropriately, not that there are no risks. So, there's no expectation on that. And everyone understands, and the SEC does as well, that you are operating in reality, and they do mention this. And part of what they're looking for is using this to address systemic risk. So really where your obligations are, right? You want to understand those risks, follow up with the vendor if there are ones of concern, and we work with our clients. We'll spoon feed them, right? Give them a template, an email of exactly what to send. So you go back to them and say, here are concerns. Is there anything you can do about that? In most cases, those concerns are minor to moderate. So what you're doing is putting collective pressure on that vendor to ultimately change their ways and keep getting better, right? If you have something that's very extreme, if you're using some, local accounting firm and they don't have the basics, right? They don't have multi-factor authentication on, or, something of that nature, yes, it's really beholden on you to put some pressure and to evaluate that vendor. But in reality, what tends to happen is those situations are very rare, and they tend to be with very small vendors for whom our clients have a lot of leverage over. And for the other vendors that you're going to run into, a high quality IT provider or your fund admin or your prime broker, they're going to be in pretty good shape on it. So you're just going to show you're aware of it, you understand those risks, and you're acting appropriately.
Yeah, if I could just add on to tell that, I agree 100%. That's exactly right. We recently asked the cyber unit this question directly because it has been a bit of a bear, and I appreciate the question very much that it's asked. It's being asked by someone who's actually thinking through how do we really comply. So certainly appreciate that. When we ask the SEC this, how realistically is an investment manager professional supposed to analyze a SOC 2 report or feedback on what is the latest and greatest technology? It's not realistic. They then provide a good answer, but I think this is sort of thematic in cybersecurity. The amount of ambiguity or unfamiliarity with some of the substance here for a typical asset manager works just as much against someone trying to comply with it as it does for them. And what I mean by this is here, as long as you're doing the things that Jacob said, I hate that this is not a helpful way to characterize it. You don't need to study and understand and mark up the SOC 2. You need to demonstrate that you're conforming to what's now, at this point in history, the best practices of getting that information and doing your best to demonstrate you're reaching out to vendors to at least understand the risk.
Great. Okay, another question. Will there be a template for the annual written report? John?
So that's a great question. Under the proposed rule, there is not. I think there will be for a form, the form ADVC. That will probably be the case. If you read the rule extensively, they provide the required elements. So our firm has put together what we think, at least under the proposed rule, what an annual written report will look like. We've already started doing this for some of our more cyber forward clients. It's a good exercise to sort of summarize where you are and getting ready for that requirement. But I do not think that the SEC, they haven't indicated that they're going to have a template like they likely will for the Form ADVC.
Great. Another question. Would SharePoint sync issues where users lose access to up-to-date files for 48 hours be considered a significant incident? Jacob?
I love this one because it lets me say it depends. So if you lost access to those files because an outside party, a malicious party, gained access to those files, right, then that's definitely a significant cybersecurity incident. But probably more where this question is going is, let's just say you lost access to those for 48 hours. That depends on the nature of your business and how you operate. So any incident that significantly disrupts or degrades the advisor's ability to maintain critical operations is a significant cybersecurity incident, right? So if you are actively trading and in those files includes your trade ladder and P&L and your model, and you use that to conduct your day-to-day operations, then absolutely it is a significant cybersecurity incident. If you're a fund of funds that makes one move, every quarter or two, and this is not at a critical time point and nothing was missing and you just had a slow couple days, then it very well may not be a critical cybersecurity incident. So that's a decision that needs to get evaluated within the context specifically of the fund's operations.
Great answer.
John, question. Where do you recommend I start? A risk assessment, cyber testing policies, other?
Yeah. So as we said, good question. Appreciate that. The risk assessment is the most informative, gentle sort of foot in the water on cybersecurity to do an assessment. You need to be careful because there are vendors that will sell you something that they're saying is an assessment that won't really fit the bill. But if you can get a qualitative assessment from someone that understands the industry we work in and what the SEC has said, that will make this sort of labyrinth of a conundrum, the cybersecurity conundrum, a lot more understandable, and it will provide the basis for all the things you have to do. So that really opens the door. I would say as a qualification to that, I talk to emerging and startup managers a lot at our firm. A precondition to this, and when I actually encourage someone to not engage with us on this just yet, is if they're not on a real discernible IT infrastructure. I always suggest an industry-specific MSP, because the MSPs in this space, like Atlas, understand these regulations and they understand how a hedge fund operates and how it operates differently than a pharmacy or an auto ship dealer, and that is incredibly important. And the stuff that myself and Jacob do are additive to that, and we can sort of advise and put controls on top of a less formal, scattered, disparate IT infrastructure where there's Dropbox and Gmail and things like that, but it's a waste of money and time, and inevitably you're going to have to burn it down and build it up. So the risk assessment is the first place, but you have to be working with an industry-specific MSP to get you set up, especially if you're like the rest of the world in some form of hybrid, decentralized work environment, as virtually every single one of our clients are.
Thank you, John. We're about out of time. There are a few remaining questions, so we will make sure to follow up with people to answer those remaining questions after the presentation. This concludes the panel discussion. I hope you all found something useful in the presentation, and of course, you're welcome to reach out to any of John, Jacob, or myself at any time. Jacob and John, I appreciate you joining me for the panel, and again, looking forward to seeing what the rule has to hold and how people respond. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.